Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our live stream critique. If you're in here and you can hear me just fine, I'm just going to do a sound check. Just type in the chat box, say hello, and let me know if you can hear me just fine. So, how did you guys find this last week? A little challenging. I know some of you have written me and said that the color part was really frustrating and challenging and different from what you're used to. And I just want to reassure you that it is all completely normal. Color is a very challenging part of portrait painting. And you will be thankful that you did this color study before we jump into color on our larger portraits. Hi, Kathy. Yes, it is very challenging. And one of the things that I did when I was first starting out, learning as a student, is I did a color study for almost every single painting that I did. And it was kind of the process I used to teach myself color. I took classes and there was some discussion of color, but nothing really in depth. And so kind of to give myself a system to learn on my own, especially outside of the classroom, I started doing color charts, but also I concentrated on keeping like a color schematic for each painting. I did a underpaint, like a little color study, and then I would keep swatches of each color and write down my mixtures. That way I could see patterns across different paintings that I tended to use, like for example, for mixtures. And also it would help me when I'm working on my larger piece to remember what colors I used. So that's one of the advantages of doing these color studies. And sometimes now I still will do color studies. I don't do them all the time, but oftentimes I do a small, either digital or especially if I'm working with like a client for a commission, I will do a color study to present them a very kind of abstract version of what the painting will be like. And my goal with color studies is not necessarily likeness, but always to focus on getting the mood of the light and the color. So I think everyone did pretty well. And I'm just going to wait another second until we have a few more people in here. Do you guys have any like general overall questions about the color? It was a lot of work, mixing up all the colors and then doing the color study. Just type in the chat box if you have any specific questions you'd like me to address before we get started here. And can everyone else hear me okay? I see there's about 5 people in here, but I've only seen Kathy type in the chat box so far. Is everyone else hearing me all right? Okay. Hi, Susan. So Kathy, you said, it seems like the more I looked at the colors, I saw them differently. Hi, Beth. Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure I'm getting through to everyone. Okay, yeah, Kathy, that is very true. And this happens to me too. Sometimes my first assessment, when I do the color study, I might have favored, and there can be different factors that play into this, and I'll talk about those in just a second. But yeah, you can look at it, and then the more you stare, the more you see. Or you might start to pick up some of those nuances. So whereas before you might have just looked at a color and said, well, that's just pink, the more you looked at it and the more you saw the color relationships around it, you might have noticed actually it's more of like a yellow pink, or maybe there's a different color next to it that's throwing it off, or maybe it's a warm pink as opposed to a cool pink. And that's actually just part of doing this color study too, is it's your first kind of stab at capturing the colors and also just figuring them out. So I think I said this in my color demo that when I move on to my larger painting, I wanted to warm up a few of the colors because I could tell that some of them were maybe a little too cool in certain areas, and it was too small of a color study to really change. So that's something I'm going to keep in mind. One of the colors, I think it was one of the lighter flesh hues, I was going to add a little bit of my lead tin yellow just to add a little more of a buttery color to it so it didn't get too gray. And that can happen when you're painting like a cooler light source like we have in our reference. So you want to make sure you're adding that balance of that warmer light too, because the warmer colors do exist even though we have that cool light source. So it really is, and I think the thing that makes skin tones so challenging is that most of the colors are neutrals or variations of neutrals, and neutrals are really hard for our eye to discern because you can put one color, like a neutral flesh color, next to a blue and it might look really warm, and then you put that same color next to a yellow and it might look really cool. And so it's all about relative colors that you place around it. So these color studies are going to inform your larger paintings. And if you're not happy with your color study, after we talk about some of my suggestions for each of you today, you can go back on top of your color study and make some of those adjustments and just adjust your notes. So that way when you get into the larger painting, you remember your mixtures and you also remember that you're going to maybe add some warmer colors in that area or whatever the suggestion was. So, Susan, you had a question. Do you find it more difficult to work off of a photo or a monitor? You know, either one can work, but I recommend sticking to one. The trying to get your monitor to calibrate with your printer can be really frustrating. I mean, you probably know this from photography too. Just in general, it's hard to get the two to kind of calibrate. I noticed my printer tends to print cooler, my monitor is a little warmer, and the colors are a little more rich. And I personally work off my monitor all the time. And the reason I like to do that is because I can zoom in and see details, and I don't have to have multiple prints. Prints are more helpful when you're working from like the drawing stage, because it's kind of hard to measure off of your monitor. Although you can use comparative measurement very much like you would work with a live model in that way, but it doesn't work as smoothly as, say, working from a print. But when I switch into color, I will be, in the videos, be working from the monitor, from my personal monitor. So you won't see that on camera. But I have my monitor kind of calibrated to a palette and tonality that I like. It's pretty balanced. Because I need to edit my artwork photos on there, so I'm pretty happy with it. But yeah, you can use your iPad, and I always find that Mac has a pretty good balanced screen as far as color goes. iPads, obviously make sure the warm nighttime setting isn't turned on, because that will change your perception of color. So if you're working at night, make sure you don't have that nighttime setting where it makes it more warm light. Sometimes the iPad can be a little cool, but so long as you're working from the same source, whether it's iPad or a monitor, it doesn't matter. You know, it might influence your painting a little bit. The nice thing about the iPad is that you can zoom in and see those details. And also they're pretty convenient in terms of portability, so you can buy those iPad kind of arm clamps and attach it to your easel, and then you have this, you know, source all the time. I have a larger monitor off to the left, and I use that pretty consistently, and I like my monitor. I can't remember the exact name of the brand, but it's a photography monitor. It's made for photographers for editing. They're kind of pricey, but it was given to me by my father-in-law, who does a lot of photography. But what I like about it is that you can actually rotate the monitor vertically and adjust your image. So if I'm working on a tall painting or a portrait, I can actually have my monitor upright in the portrait position and have a larger reference to work from. So I personally like that, and I'll try to find the name of it and post it on the forum. So Beth, you're asking, is it helpful to isolate an area of the monitor by holding up gray paper? You know, I haven't tried that. You see, here's the challenge with working from a monitor. When you're looking at a monitor, it's emitting light. Okay, so that's different than looking at a sheet of paper, right, where the light's hitting the surface. And so what can be a little challenging if you're not used to working from a monitor is the perception of brightness. And so I don't know if it would actually work like what you're thinking, where you hold up an isolated card and you can, like if you're working from life, you can hold it up to the model. I think that card might look really dark against an illuminated screen. So I'm not sure if it would work in quite the same way. And the same goes for comparing a color with your palette knife. Like I showed you how to do that on a print. So the monitor can present some unique challenges in that way. When I'm working from a monitor, I don't usually have it at the brightest setting. I have it somewhere in the middle to kind of try and balance that out a little bit. That way I'm not having this glaring brightness and then I'm looking at my painting and it's throwing my eyes off. So I try to kind of balance that out because the monitor is just more convenient in general. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the critiques, and as questions come up, just feel free to type them in. So Kathy, we're going to go ahead and start with you. And there was a resource that I'm going to post a little bit later today in the forum on photographing. It was a website that was emailed to me, and I'm going to post that in the forum because it was a great little tutorial on how to photograph really small pieces. That was probably one of the challenges of photographing your color studies, was getting them without glare, because the canvas weave for the scale is so large that it tends to disrupt the picture. So don't worry if your color, if everything looks a little glary for this picture. I can work with it, but when you do work on your larger piece, if you're working on panel, you won't have as much of that texture interference. But if you are working on like a linen or a more textured panel, try to get your light source close to 45 degrees from the upper corners of your painting. So like, let me just show you what that looks like. So this will just be a quick little tutorial. So let's say you have your painting like this. Let me switch to a pen. So here's your portrait on your easel. You want it upright. You want your lights to be slightly in front of your painting, but coming at almost a 45-degree angle to the top corners. And what that does is it will illuminate, and you can just use like little clamp lights with balanced CFLs. You want the CFLs to be like close to north light, as close to like 5,000 Kelvin rating as you can. You can find those if you just look. You can buy them on Amazon, or you can buy them. And you also might want to look at if you're getting kind of serious about photographing your artwork, look at the color rendering index. It's also called CRI. I can find probably a resource and share it with everyone that'll kind of go a little bit more in depth. But one of the advantages to having your light source at that 45-degree angle is if you get any glare, it's going to be, in these upper corners, and it's not going to be down the middle of your portrait. I tend to actually have my LED light that I paint under at a 45-degree. I don't have two of them because it's just too much light to paint under, but I have mine in the upper left corner because I'm right-handed, and that way my arm, when it's up, casts a shadow to the right and it doesn't interfere with my visual of my painting, but it doesn't give me glare when I'm working. I also have north-facing windows on the left side for the same reason. I don't want my arm casting a shadow over, if the light was coming from this direction, over the area I'm trying to paint, so, because I'm right-handed. So if you're left-handed, you might want your light source on the right side. Just something to think about as you're setting up your space. Obviously we can't all have an ideal space. I painted out of my living room for years and years and years before I actually had a proper studio built with where I could customize the lighting the way I needed it. The north light windows sometimes cause glare, so I have curtains that I can close. I also have a sheer curtain that has bars that I can move it up and diffuse the light. So those are just some things to kind of think about as you're kind of developing your practice and your studio space. Lighting does become more and more important, and you don't want to paint under like really warm incandescent lights because it's going to throw off your colors. And it looked like some of you guys had photographed under a warmer light source, and I could tell because of that yellowing of the colors. So if you can go down to the hardware store and just pick up the Cool Light CFLs, the compact fluorescents, and photograph under those, you're going to get a little bit more of an accurate rendering. And what I recommend is actually having a warm light and a cool light. I use an LED because it allows me to switch temperature between warm and cool, and I can kind of balance the lighting as it shifts throughout the year to match my windows. I didn't mean to go on such a tangent, but that's just something to think about as you guys are photographing your work, because there will be slight differences between, you know, maybe what you guys are seeing and what you're sending me. So just so I'm not making you make unnecessary changes, just start to think about some of your lighting. And if you guys have questions about the lighting setup, just post it in the forum, and I'll share maybe a picture of my setup and details on the LED light that I use. It's not a very expensive one. I think it's now $50. It was $130 when I bought it, when it was brand new, but now they sell them for about $50, and they're great to work under. It has a dimmer, it's all on remote control, and it has a warm and cool temperature gauge, so you can actually put it at the Kelvin rating that you want. I think I keep mine around 48 to 5200 Kelvin. It's not perfect north light, but I have it slightly warmer because I find that the LED blue light is just too blue. So I try to match kind of the sense of the warm light I see coming, that warm cool light coming in, that balanced light from my north facing windows. I also find that when you place pieces in a gallery, sometimes they have warmer lights. And so, you know, that's always a dilemma. Do you paint under what the gallery is going to be showing your work under, or do you paint, you know, under balanced light? And I just try to compromise that just a little bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump back into the critique here. Okay, so just looking at the feeling in her skin tone, I see maybe a little more warmth. And this could be if you're working from a print, then if your print feels a little cooler, that could be why your reference feels a little bit cooler, or your color study feels a little cooler. I do see some nice warm colors that you have in here. And we did talk about how you have a situation where you have a warm light source and cool shadows. So it's almost opposite of what I'm doing in my demonstration, because I have a cool light source with warmer shadows. Yeah, so you can kind of increase your saturation in specific areas. If you do it everywhere, she will look too orange. But you can see, like, there's certain areas where adding kind of a really, really rich chroma can bring life to the portrait, and it doesn't even have to be in the skin tones. So if you look, for example, here in the ear, in those shadows, if you make them that rich red that I'm seeing, that red-orange, and you just bump up that chroma, it's going to warm up the whole illusion of the ear. The same goes in the portrait. Look for color zones in the face, and in this picture it's perhaps a little harder to see, but typically this zone here is the red zone. So you're going to have more pink and red through these areas. When you move down from the mouth down here, that's kind of the cooler blue-green zone. Okay, and she looks like she has a warmer complexion overall, so you might have more of a warm green-gray in certain areas. And then of course the forehead, she has her hair over it, so it's not as, it's typically more of a yellow zone. And of course in the eyes, I always see a lot more pink and a little bit of a purple blue. If you look carefully in these areas where the skin gets very, very thin and fragile, you'll see a lot more of the capillaries, and usually it'll take on either a greenish or a purplish hue, depending on if their skin tones are warm or cool. But if you kind of punch up the chroma in some of those subtle areas like the lips, the nose, the cheeks, a little bit in the eyes, and these dark shadows like the nostril or the ear, it's going to make the whole painting feel a little bit more colorful. So I'm going to do a little paint over on yours, kind of showing you how that could affect your painting. I'll try that brush. So first things first, I'm just going to select that warm color that I'm seeing. It's a little darker. And I think that's another thing, is the contrast in your painting could be punched up a little bit. So we'll talk about that, and especially when it comes to those shadows. But if you just imagine placing and you can see that the darks in the ear are kind of a red-orange, and even her ear probably has more of a peachy quality to it rather than a cool pink. So just pay attention to some of that. I'm going to maybe select something in between so it's not so drastic. But usually the chroma will intensify in some areas like the ear, or you know, I always tend to add quite a bit of red in the ear. Not to make it look, you know, swollen or anything, but you just pay attention to where, you know, parts of the skin that has a little bit more intensity or concentration of color. So like if you look at hands, for example, you'll see more pink in the knuckles, and the rest of the hand is kind of more neutral. And that can vary person to person, but generally speaking, the ears are going to have a little more chroma, and the same goes for the nose. I would say just a little bit warmer. And you know what would make a beautiful color for these areas is a mixture of cadmium red, yellow ochre, and white. That's going to give you a nice peachy color, and you can control how red or yellow that is. And then of course add a touch of blue to neutralize it just a little bit, but it's going to give you more of that peachy color that's a little warmer. And I would go through and add touches of that to the cheek area where this maybe got more of a cool pink. Maybe push it towards a little bit more yellow pink, more of that peachy color. And that's going to add, again, that little punch of chroma. She has maybe a little bit more color in the cheek as it turns away. And then you'll notice what's interesting, because you have a light colored background. If you look in here, let me grab a pen so I can. There's like this color where we see this plane change right in here, right? Let me just grab a dark brown. So we have this plane change right here. And then right behind it, the color cools just slightly. So we have this warm kind of color, and then right adjacent to it, you can see that comparison. It's slightly darker, but it's more neutral. So you would basically be taking this color here the warmer peach tone, that's a darker shade of what's here. It's a little bit more deep. But then you would just add blue, a very small amount of it. And what that's going to do is it's going to help separate these two planes. And typically, the reason that happens is we have a little more peach fuzz right along this back edge, and so it kind of creates a little bit more cool tone. And that's where you'll start to see more of that green-gray zone, is along the jawline. And then it really warms up in this area here. While we're zoomed in, you can see in here she has some very purple tones. And even on this side, you have these kind of bluish purple tones. Don't be afraid to push the chroma on those a little bit. if they look very neutral in the painting or in the photo reference, push them just a little bit more. And it'll add a little more life to the portrait. She's wearing a little bit of makeup too, and so she has that kind of purple gray hue there as well. And when you get into the eyes, don't forget, like these areas, that's a perfect area, just like in the ear, to punch that chroma just a little bit more. So like if we took that color there, which is kind of an orangey mauve tone, and then, you know, obviously this is a color study, so we can't get that detailed, but you just kind of push that color a little bit more in that crease. And I always tend to say, as a rule of thumb, creases should be very warm. Do not ever make them really cold black. Always make them a warm hue, and it's going to add more life to that color. And that's one of the tricks I use. Same thing goes for like a nostril opening or like crease in the mouth. If you're going to have to make it a color, make it a really deep, rich red. One of my favorite mixtures is to use alizarin crimson with transparent oxide red and maybe a touch of blue if it needs to go darker. And it's a warm, transparent color that just works beautifully where you have these nearly black creases, like here in the mouth, even where you have a really dark tone, like for the tear duct. Instead of making that kind of a gray, make it a rich red, and it will always add more life to your portraits. If you study Dutch painting, like if you look at, well, Rembrandt and Van Dyck, look at those areas, and you will be surprised that they don't actually make them very dark. Even though they are darker, they make them very rich and saturated, and it just brings the portrait to life. So even if your photo kind of lacks that, we have to inform our images with, you know, studying from life and those sorts of things. And you can see, like here, there's a really rich chromatic color in her lip. So don't be afraid to start to push those areas. Again, I think with regards to her lips, maybe going with a little bit more of a warm pink in certain areas. The shadows could be a cooler pink, but maybe towards the light, go with more of a peachy tone, and it's going to add a little more chroma to the mouth area. There are cooler areas, like as it starts to turn into shadow, it goes kind of more of a mauve tone, and it goes quite deep in value. But just adding a few areas of that richer color is going to really help the portrait. I know they look jarring right now against the cooler tones here, but if you are going to make a few changes, I would do it on your color study before you jump into your larger painting. Let's see. As far as your shadows go, I just feel like the color, and I can't tell if it's the glare, but I feel like the color is pretty spot on. It just needs to be not as maybe detailed in that shadow mask. Don't be afraid to kind of generalize that dark mask and then add accent dark. So instead of going in and adding like reflected lights, in this case, go in and push a few areas darker. And that's going to help build that vibrancy over in the light mask. I think your color's maybe a little blue on this side plane. I see it as more of a kind of violet, a very muted violet. There is some blue in there, but yeah, when I'm looking at the color, I feel like if you add it a little more kind of a purple hue, it's going to complement that warmer orange skin tone. So do you have any questions? I'm trying to think if there's any other areas. Usually with warmer light too, you're going to get a little bit more of a bump in the warmth just before it turns into shadow, especially in these color zones. So like right near the nose, you might go in with a tile of a deeper orange. And it gets maybe a little more gray and neutral as it comes up into that keystone shape. Yeah, that purple starts to kind of warm a little bit but it wraps around. You can also add a little bit more contrast maybe as that form starts to turn. Yeah, I think still that is maybe a little too saturated, but you know, I think maybe your colors, they look a little more influenced by maybe alizarin crimson. Try swapping out that alizarin for a cadmium red. So maybe try using a more cadmium red, less of the alizarin, and that's going to give you more of these warmer peach tones. And you know, you don't need to completely change the colors. What I would do is take something like the color you have here, right? And I would just add a little bit of like a cad red to it, and then add your white, and that's going to warm it up, and I think you'll find kind of a happy middle ground for your color. You'll notice too, like as these colors turn towards these shadows, you're going to get these kind of neutral zones, but they're still a little bit warmer. So I think maybe this got a little cool. Your shadows are cool, so you want to make sure the light masses have a little more warmth to them. There will be these zones where it's kind of a middle transition. And don't be afraid to leave it more tiled in your study and more abstract, just so that you can see what you kind of intended for that area in terms of color. So try starting off by, starting maybe with the color, but just push it a little bit more peach. So add a touch of cadmium, and that cadmium red can be very strong. So just start with a little bit, mix it in, see how much more you might want to add. If it goes too pink, add a little ochre and then white to bring up the value again to the normal value that you had it, and then see if that kind of helps the shift. Okay? Do you have any further questions? This is kind of a challenging photo just because of the nature of her skin tones, and you have this warmer light, and in my demonstration I was talking about the cool light. So yeah, just post an update when you've played with your colors, or if you've changed your mixtures a little bit, send me a picture of your palette along with your color study, or post it in the forum, and I'll give you some feedback. Now, Kathy, are you working from a print? Or are you working for this color stage? Or are you working from a monitor? Because that could be what's influencing your color too. If you're working from a print, sometimes it prints cooler or maybe more gray, and that could be where your color influence was happening. So you're working from a monitor. Yeah, so just make sure you're still working from the same source. Other colors, like in the hair, everything else looks fine. Even your background color, it could be a little warmer. You can see here, this is maybe a little bit of a warmer gray. But if you want to keep it more complementary to the skin tones, you can keep it more of the blue. It doesn't really matter. I always change my background. I'll probably even change it in my larger painting as the portrait progresses. So that's just something to keep in mind. But good work. And if you have any follow-up questions, just post it in the forum. All right, Suzanne, you are up. So yeah, nice work on your color study. My feeling is that if you work with maybe a little bit less green, it's going to help. I think it could have something to do with some of the background color too. The background color, if you push it a little bit more red and blue rather than the green color, it's going to help complement that red-orange in her hair. So let me just do a quick paint over. So you could take the color that you had and just add a little bit of alizarin crimson to it, and maybe a little touch of blue, and see if that helps, because that already, you can see just from painting that over, it completely transformed the feeling and the skin tones even. Although I still sense that maybe this color is a little too olive green. Let me see if I can identify. I think that looks like the color there. Yeah. So maybe with this color here, I would push it maybe a little bit more, maybe more gray. So rather than having it a yellow green, make it more of like a bluish color. So let's see, it's a pretty neutral gray if I look in that general area. What I would do is take maybe a touch of burnt sienna, a very, very small amount, or a little tiny bit of cadmium red. And so I would say add, I'll make a note on here for you, add cad red or burnt sienna. And that's going to help with that jump a little bit. You do want it cooler, but it just feels maybe a little too suddenly green. Another suggestion is that I would maybe take this color and make it a little, she feels a little washed out in the portrait. Actually, it's not so much up here, but down here. There should be this fall off of light. So if I take the reference here and do a color swatch, okay, so that's the color down towards the lower outer jaw. I'll actually put it here so it's a little easier to see. And then if we take the color up here, you can see the value difference. And what you have is almost identical values. So I think what you want to do is push some of your midtones a little bit darker. So I would take something like this color and add a little bit more of a deeper neutral down there, transition with that warmer pink. Let me see, maybe that color might be too light. No, that's actually pretty good. And you can see just doing that small amount has already helped to create that sense of that fall off of light as the light moves down the form this way, just by darkening this lower section here. She'll have a little bit of light hitting that chin, a little brighter, and of course in the muzzle. But don't forget that tile of this section here, where it goes a little bit more dark as that form is rounding back. And it's actually picking up a little bit of that background, so it's taking on a little bit more of a violet. Also in the ball of the chin, there's a little bit more of a rich pink, so I would suggest just increasing the chroma. You have beautiful chroma in the cheeks. Add just a little bit of that rosy hue, maybe like something like this color, just a hint of it before it turns to that green gray. And maybe go just a little deeper, carry that over just a little bit more. With the nose, I would also beef up the chroma just a touch, right where it starts to turn under. Maybe not that red. I would maybe take this color here and add maybe a little bit of this one. So take a little bit of that color and that color and find something in between, right? So you'll end up with something that's just a little more rosy. And then you're going to want to add that just as the ball of the nose turns under. Let's push it a little bit more pink. And right before it hits that side plane. What adding a little bit of red before the shadow does on the nose is it helps bring that forward. Cool colors tend to recede and warm colors tend to pull forward. So it does help to pay attention to that logic. And I would also tile in a transition tone. And don't forget that this keystone shape is usually a value step down from the value above it. So if I look here, she has maybe just a slightly deeper color just across here. Let's try that color there. Yeah, something like maybe what you use in between those two. It doesn't need to be a real hard transition. I'm just leaving it a little bit more obvious so that you could see that. Okay. I'm just looking for a few other things. The hair is maybe a little orange, but that could easily be solved by just taking a cooler brown. And I think it's just that her hair got too light. So just look for those darker masses and, you know, put in, especially on this far side. That brush is too big. Don't be afraid to build that contrast, especially because you have a lighter background here. She really pops out from that background by having that darker contrast there. And you could probably go just a little darker there in the hair. And that builds a nice contrast for her face. Her shadow color on her face could be a little light. I think it looks like you used more of this color. I would go in with just a little bit more of your chocolate brown. And even if you just add it to the top half here and then fade it down and leave more of that reflected light towards the lower jaw, that's going to, again, build a little more contrast in the portrait. But otherwise, you have a really nice piece. I would push her shirt maybe a little darker. Again, building that contrast, especially towards the back. You can see how truly dark that gets on that back side of the shirt. And that's going to help silhouette her against our backdrop. So maybe just take that and down a value step. It looks like this might be your color. Did you use a different color than this one? Because that seems right, actually, when I look at your palette. Did you mix anything else out into these areas? It looks like it has maybe a little more yellow. But this blue that you have here that I selected on your palette seems actually like almost the perfect color, especially for these darker parts. You could even leave this top half maybe a little bit more green, but maybe just spread out this dark blue that you had, just to build a little more contrast to the face. Only a tad lighter in the lights. Yeah, I would just push that down a little bit darker. And then on the neck, just make sure that you don't make it this bright. Again, it's that idea of that fall off of light. it's really close to that lower value that we see down here, but it's even cooler. So maybe take some of that color and just add a little blue to it and just knock that down. I know it feels really bright, but that's just due to some of the contrast. So if you just added like it looks like that color up here. Let's see. So it looks like this color, but just adding blue for the neck. All right, but good work. So those are just some notes to keep in mind as you're prepping your colors for the larger painting. If your colors, I made a note on our forum today, if your colors are starting to dry out or they're too small of a pile, you're going to want plenty of paint for working on the first pass of the larger portrait. And that lesson will be delivered middle of the week. Week 5's lesson is going to be delivered a little earlier. So today there's lessons on planes and a couple of kind of preliminary concepts I want everyone to understand before we commit to painting on our painting. I would make these changes to your color study first, just because it is your guide for your larger piece. And if you want me to look at your color study again before you start on your color painting, just post it in the forum. But really nice work. And let me know if you have any follow-up questions. Okay, Angela. I can't tell if in this picture you're photographing under a warm light. You're welcome, Suzanne. But I kind of get that feeling based on this white here. So I think what I'm going to do is, does this picture look a little warmer than your color study feels in real life, Angela? Yeah, it does. Okay, so I'm going to just remove some of that yellow. Maybe take out some of the red, just a touch. That's too blue. Okay, I'm going to just place it there. It's a little bit adjusted, and that will help. Okay, so I would say my first impression is maybe the green is a little strong. Oh, your color study is darker in real life? Okay, let me try and bring that down a little bit. Maybe that a little closer. Let me bring down some of these brightest highlights too. Okay, so I'm going to go based on this here. So yeah, I think you have some of the basic colors pretty good. She feels maybe a little bit green in this color here. So I would say that's probably this color on your palette. I think one thing that would help is to have another color somewhere between these two, because partly there's a big value jump there, but also we need that warmer color before we transition to these cooler colors, something just a little bit more chromatic. I know you have your accent colors down here for like the cheek, but maybe something not mixed between these, but more like this color, but darker and warmer. maybe more pink. So maybe taking even these two colors, maybe add this pink to that color and add a pile in between. I'll just clean up my notes so it's a little easier for you to read. So make a pile in between these two. And I would use that, you know, in some of these zones because you can kind of sense that peachy tone. So maybe something close to this. So it's going to be a little more neutral. You might end up adding a little black to it. Or sorry, not black, blue. So make something kind of like that color. And that's going to be a nice transition between this green, because it's closer in value, and then your lighter color. And that's one of the hardest parts about color, is maintaining the right chroma and the value. So there's going to be times when things get kind of washed out too quickly. And so you want to make sure that the skin tones feel lively. And so you might end up adding another tile. So I'm going to actually just paint that in. Oops. Okay, I'm going to have to add this on a new layer. Hold on. Let me select that color again. So there's that color. So if I took that color and I added a little bit of that here before it transitions to that green, that's coming out too light. I think that color looks a little deeper there. Before that. And also don't forget that overall her skin tone has more of a pinkish purple. So you might be getting a little too green in there. You might neutralize it. Just take a little bit of I would say a little alizarin or cadmium red and add just a touch. Probably alizarin is going to go more violet. So maybe take this color here. So you have more of a pink here, but your jump to this color might be a little sudden. So maybe add a very small amount of alizarin crimson, or the equivalent to that color, a very small amount, just to take it away from that yellow-green a touch. Because you can see now that this kind of goes from like this peachy light color that's really nice, and then it rolls into a mid-tone, and then it rolls into a more neutral, and then you get more of the deep green right next to that warm shadow. It's almost like moving across the rainbow of colors. I would say the same for down in here. Go just a little bit deeper value down in that area. Even something like this might work. Let's try it out. Yeah, so if you made that neutral color here, try using that down in the lower jaw a little bit to keep those brightest points up in here where they belong. It'll give you that nice fall off of light. Again, watch the intensity in the neck. You might find yourself doing something maybe more like this color in the forehead. Maybe a little more pink. And just keep it softer and not nearly as bright as you get up in the face. And with your shadow colors, I think your shadow colors are plenty dark. This color, it's hard to tell if that's what you put in here, but you might consider just overall maybe deepening the shadow on the face towards the top, and leaving more of the reflected light down towards the bottom. Just don't be afraid to push that value a little bit deeper. But everything else looks pretty good. Your background color looks pretty good. You might consider a gradient, going to like more of a neutral brown in this corner, and that can create a nice kind of drama, kind of moving diagonally, having it a little darker on the light side of the face and a little bit lighter behind the contrast of the hair. That'll just create a more dynamic flow. Yeah, but that's pretty much it. Do you have any questions? All right, good work. If you have follow-up questions, just post it in the forum. All right, Susan, we are all set to go over yours. I wanted to share this picture here, not just the color study. I'll zoom in on that here soon, but one thing I like that you did, and this is something I used to do quite often too, was that you included color swatches on your canvas on the outside of it. I used to do this also on the back side of my canvas, or I would have a larger canvas and I would just do my little 5x7. But it's a really nice kind of way to keep your notes all together, especially for your color swatches. And if you end up making changes to these colors, you can make notes, you know, saying, okay, I took this color and I added blue, and then it gave me this, and that's what I'm going to use there instead. So it's kind of a nice condensed way. I like the way you did that. And then you have everything kind of in its own zone. Background, shirt, shadow. So yeah, nice work on that. Okay, so I can't tell if the picture looks of your painting is a little warm. This light kind of feels a little warm, so I'm gonna, you let me know if the color is off a little bit if you're in here. But I'm going to maybe just do a little color balancing and just take down some of that yellow. Not too much. I don't want to alter your colors too much. Okay, I think that looks a little more balanced. Yeah, the color recipes can be helpful, but even having these clean color swatches, it's really useful because if you ever run out of one of your colors on your palette, you have this that you can try and match. So you can mix your color and then do a little swatch next to it and see if it matches what you had mixed there. So even if you didn't get a chance to write down your mixtures, which can be helpful, but sometimes even writing them is a little hard because you can't really divide up in a recipe. Like, you could kind of I used to give myself rough measurements, like I did, you know, 1 part red, or, you know, 1 part yellow ochre to half a part red or something, but there's no real like measurement tool. So that's something that can kind of be confusing if you're just writing it down. But if you actually have a little color swatch, you could say I used blue, you know, white, and a little bit of, I don't know, brown. You know, you can just make little notes like that so you remember which pigments you used, but not necessarily the ratios. So you feel like her skin tones are too gray? I would say, yeah, they probably feel a little bit green to me. I think she has a few more like kind of mauve-y pink areas that we can push. So let's take a look at that real quick. Let's start in the forehead. I think it's very similar. she has this kind of peachy mauve tone that kind of picks up here just after that kind of greenish gray transition. So I would say taking another pink tone. Let me see what you have on your palette here. So maybe taking this color, which is kind of a yellow peach tone, that looks like that's what you have there. And let me get back to my ink so I can make a note for you. So I would take a little bit of this color and make something for right here. And I would just add maybe a little bit of this color to it and maybe a touch of blue. And that should give you something close to this color that I'm seeing here. And I'll do a color swatch for you. Making sure I'm doing that on another layer. Yeah, so I think something just before it goes into that. And maybe this color here is a little yellow. I'm thinking this color right here is maybe too yellow. So you might try adding a touch of, well, yellow. If we add red, it's going to go to kind of orange. Add a little bit of alizarin to that color. Let me clean up my notes so it's not so confusing. So you're going to mix so what you have here is that color. So that's going to give you that color there. And then this, to this color, it might be too yellow. I would add a little bit of alizarin. Just a touch. And maybe blue if the alizarin doesn't quite do it. Now, are you working from a monitor, Susan? It's darker than it's showing up? Okay, because that's looking quite yellow. Is that more like what we're seeing in here? That almost looks like the darker brown. Is your painting a little bit darker too? Like if I brought this down just a little bit. Wait, let me make sure I'm on the correct layer. Is that a little bit more accurate? It looks a little closer to what it seems like it would be. Yeah, you're working from a monitor. Okay. Well, I think if you basically took some of the, just added a few more pink tones, you could leave some of those olive greens because they'll complement those pink tones. It's just that the olive green goes from that to just a kind of a cooler light color that you have here. So I feel like we need to add just a little bit of another color in between to help that transition right through this zone here, kind of overlapping a little bit. It's still a cool color, but it's more of a mauve tone, like it has like a purplish quality to it. And I'm thinking maybe some of these colors on the right side, the lightest colors, are maybe too pale too soon. So I would maybe take this one and make it a little darker. It can be more of a pinkish color, but maybe just go a little slower with these steps. I can't quite tell because this picture looks maybe a touch blown out. But maybe finding
because these look so similar in value, it's kind of hard for me to tell. I would make maybe this one more chromatic. Maybe more of a peachy color. Maybe something like that. So it's not so yellow, maybe a little more pink from that one. A little deeper, and then you can have these two lighter ones. But having something like that's going to be useful in a few areas, like right before it gets to that lighter yellow. Let me take a sample of some of this color, because that looks a little bleached out, but yeah, it's hard to tell. It looks like this was the main color you used a lot of, this one here. And it has a little more of a yellow hue, and if that starts to mix directly with your green, you're going to end up with more of a green, like overall feeling. The palette, let's see, it is blown out. I don't know if it helps to look at the color swatches. Okay, yeah, maybe I'll take a look at those. Yeah, okay, I see these colors here. It looks like you actually have, that looks like a good color. Okay, yeah, I could see what you're saying. That color is maybe a little more, should be maybe a little more rosy. That bottom one. Maybe just a little bit more of a red in it, a warmer red. And those reds are going, by building up some of those reds, you're going to really balance out some of that green effect that's happening. You have a decent fall off of light there, so I'm not too concerned about that. You might find yourself needing to pop that highlight a little bit more, or pushing the other midtones deeper. Maybe using more of that cool mauve tone towards the bottom. And don't forget to add a little bit of your accent pink, a little bit in the chin, because that's another one of the warm zones, and that will help to balance that out. Yeah, I think actually this color might be okay. It feels a little green even still. I would just push maybe a little bit more red. Because when I put this one here, you can see it takes on this kind of, when I compare it to the other one, it takes on kind of a green cast, even when I select it from here. So just take another look at that area, and you might just play with the color and test out a few. One thing you can do with your color study is make sure you oil it out before you test a new color on it. And that way, if you paint a color on and you're like, oh, I don't like that, you can wipe it off really easily with a Q-tip. Another thing you can do is apply an isolation layer, like coat it with liquid and let it dry. Or you could do a retouch varnish and let that dry. And that way, when you paint over the top of it, if you're making your color adjustments, you can easily wipe it off if you're not happy with the color you're testing. I think maybe a little more blue, I can't tell, but it feels like maybe the background could be darker in some areas and maybe a little less red. If you add like maybe a little more blue to your, where's your color swatch for the background? Oh, it looks like you have, no, it looks like you have the right color based on the color swatch. Maybe just applying it a little more heavily so it's not so thin. That's going to help balance out a little bit. And don't forget, sometimes that background color ends up in the skin tone, and you really see that down in the neck. So you might even take that background color and maybe make 2 value steps and just add that to your skin tone range. That way you can grab it and use it as these forms start to turn. It would basically be that color, but lighter. Maybe a little less saturated. Something like that. Oh, that's almost perfect. So that might be something that you start to push into a few areas where you know those forms are turning away from you and they're starting to move towards the background. They're going to start to pick up that background color. Oh, okay, so that's what happened. Yeah, and you know, that's something to keep in mind as you guys are mixing colors. Colors behave differently if they're applied thin versus more opaquely and thick. Colors work differently as a glaze. So you probably noticed that as that color got thinned out, it didn't have as much of that blue and it took on that more red-orange. So that can definitely change the feeling, even in some of your transparent colors, like in the jawline. If you painted that on a little thicker, it might actually have captured the correct hue and temperature. All right, well, do you have any further questions? Yeah, you might even find yourself taking that and making one step lighter and just, you know, just to have a few more accent colors. And what I would do is add those under the accent color section when you organize your palette. All right, perfect. Yeah, nice work. These color studies are challenging. There's no doubt about that. But it's a great thing to kind of do because you're not making these mistakes on your large painting, which can be a little nerve-wracking because there you're also trying to juggle your drawing as well. So if you feel comfortable, you can make changes to this one, or you can just take another fresh stab at doing another value study. If you watch the new lectures, there's one where I talk about using the planes to paint a color study as well. And I give an example of that and how, you know, the planes really define what we see in terms of like the shadow shapes and the light shapes. So you could always try doing like a planes, another color study, kind of an abstract plane study, and play with your colors on that one too. So, all right, good work. All right, Beth, you are up. And just real quick, let me know if your color study, I know you had sent me 2 pictures because you were struggling to capture, one of them felt like, I think you had photographed it outside, and this one I think you photographed inside. I'm going to go ahead and go with this one because the other one had a lot of glare and it was a little harder to see. But if this looks a little light or darker than what you have, just let me know. My feeling is that maybe it's a little light, so I'm going to bring that value down just a little bit. Oops, wrong layer. Okay. Yeah, it's probably somewhere in there. Okay. Your color study is darker. Okay. All right, so does that look a little better? Based on the background, it looks like it's more in that range. Okay. Yeah, you have a nice start to your study. I like the tiling you did in the cheeks. The only thing I could say is that maybe some of these colors feel a little bit too yellow, and they could use a little more pink to them. So if I were taking a swatch from this, for example, I would, oops, sorry, I accidentally pushed the Siri button. So I would take that color and maybe just push it a little bit more like that. So you could take that same color because they're not too far off in value, and I would just add a little bit of pink to it. So I'm going to make a note for you there. So that is that color there, and I would just say add maybe a little bit of Cad Red or alizarin do some tests and see which one, because you want it to be kind of a vibrant, cooler pink. But not quite maybe as pink as what you have in the cheeks here. Let's see what that looks like. It's a little bit deeper. Yeah, find kind of a happy middle there. It just feels maybe a little yellow. And then I would definitely look for those areas where you can push the chroma also, like in the chin. So that actually looks very close to that color, so maybe you could take that same color and just bump a little pink in the chin, and I would even take some of the color from the cheeks here and just add a little bit down towards where that chin is starting to turn under, just before it gets kind of cool and green. Now that's going to help bring it forward. It looks like you have enough pink in the nose, so that's not a problem. And your neutral tone down here looks great. Don't push the neck so bright. I would maybe push that a little bit. And maybe a little cooler. Especially in this section, it's not so green as it is kind of a violet. So I would definitely look at maybe taking some of your background color and making a short, like a short value scale with that. So if I take that color and I just make it lighter, that should give you a nice accent color to add into some of these areas where those forms are turning. Like in here, maybe not that dark, but somewhere in the middle. And same thing down here. It's as those forms are starting to turn away from us and facing towards the background. The only exception, the reason we have more green on this side here in those transitions is because of her shirt. So being aware of the environment and how it affects the skin tones, like we have this side, this plane is facing this here. So it's going to be picking up maybe a little more of that. But as these planes are facing out here, they're going to be picking up some of that background color or the color that the model was in, whatever environment. And that's very true here in the neck. You can see it picks up that purple tone. So paying attention to where those planes are facing. If she was wearing a very, very red shirt, she might have more warming all the way through. But because this, you can see it's warm here because of the full red in the cheek, the color zone, but down in here, it's being influenced by this as well. So just being aware of those things can make a difference. So yeah, let me make you a quick note there. So that's background plus white. So just make yourself a couple of value steps. That way you can use those in your accent pile and play with adding those into the skin tones. Do you have any questions? Oh, and don't forget, like when you get into areas like the lips, don't be afraid to push the chroma maybe a little bit more. If you squint your eyes, the lips overall are a little bit darker. Like over in here. And a little bit more chromatic than the rest of the face. So don't be afraid to push some of those areas a little bit more too, because that's just going to add a little more life to the skin tones overall. All right, great. Good work. All right, Susan, are you in here? I just wanted to ask you if you're with us right now. I'm not sure if you were able to attend live, but if this color looks a little maybe saturated in the photo. And I'm also wondering if it's maybe a little warm based on that color behind it. Yeah, it's hard for me to tell. It just seems like everything is maybe a little too chromatic, and maybe a little bright. Let me bring that down. That seems to help a little bit. Those highlights are a little hot in the picture, just in the photo, a little bright. So I'm going to bring that down and see if that helps capture a little more accuracy. Yeah, I can't quite tell where your color sits, but my feeling is that the picture just took a little too strong of a saturation. And sometimes it depends on what you're photographing with, but some cameras just have a tendency to do that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the colors. I think it's pretty close, but looking at this and looking at your painting, some of my suggestions, if your painting looks drastically different in person, then keep that in mind. But one of the things I would say first off is to tone down that richness of the background. It's a little intense, and you can see that this purple is more, it's like a pretty muted brown violet, and so I would maybe take and neutralize that background. You can find kind of a happy middle, but I think if you added, what I would do, since you have such a strong purple, is add a little bit of yellow, probably yellow ochre, and a touch of blue, and just make it more of a gray with a slight tint towards the purple. But since you're starting off so purple, I would look at how you could just neutralize that just a little bit. Because you can see that that helps to, now the skin tones where they're more saturated, they really stand out. Before it was that background that was grabbing my eye so strong. It's still a complementary color to her hair, which is great, but now we have that nice kind of neutral purple background that's going to help her skin tones feel more vibrant, and it's not competing too much. And another suggestion would be, don't be afraid to push that value in the hair down into more of a silhouette, especially on the shadow side, but push that contrast in the hair just a little bit more. It gets pretty dark on that outside edge, and that's going to add more drama to the portrait overall as well. Now I would say with the skin tones, they feel like, I can't tell if the picture's just bleached out, but it feels like maybe you could take this color and maybe use it a little more broadly, or make a color that's something in between and use it here. So maybe something, right now you have that, and then on the other side you have this, and it's just a bit of a jump. So maybe mixing the two colors together. I'll move that over there. So just keep that in mind. Maybe another transition color in that forehead. Something in between those two is going to give you a nice kind of middle. It might even be too pink. You can make it a little bit more yellow if you like, but that's going to just help the highlights feel brighter. When we jump to a highlight too soon, what happens often is that the highlights, the specular highlights, have less impact. And so if you're feeling like here in the nose, you have a great value behind the highlight because it gives that contrast for the highlight that it really needs. Down in here, this is definitely an area where you're going to want to push that value a little bit darker, and it's going to pick up some of that background color. So you might take your deeper mauve skin tone and add a little bit of the background color plus some white, and just give yourself more of a neutral tone for down in here, this lower jaw section below. It's below the pink in the cheek. And then of course she does get a little bit more of a highlight pickup on her chin again, and then she has that light tone on the side plane there of the muzzle. Your green might be a little too green in terms of saturation. It should be more of a green-gray. That's a little too purple. I would say take something like your green, but let's turn it a little more of a blue-gray instead. Something a little bit more like that. Before it hits that shadow. So maybe a little less yellow in there. That's going to help. So something like that color. Often what happens in these areas is you actually have the skin tones kind of mixing, and it just serves as a transition tone. So you might have, like, for example, another dark shadow here, and it's mixing in with that core shadow color right along that edge. And that being said, I think you could maybe build the contrast in the side plane of the face a little bit. And that might mean that you need to go a bit darker in the hair space behind the face. That way you can push this to the right value. And that's going to help the contrast for the overall portrait too. But those are pretty much my suggestions. Don't forget to look at her overall. Her hair mass is a bit darker. I can't tell if this is just glare, but I think your highlight colors are good. Just need a little bit more contrast, especially where her hair meets the background. It really helps to silhouette her a little bit against that background. And it creates a lot of contrast to the portrait. All right. Nice job. If you have any follow-up questions, just let me know. Again, like I mentioned with a couple of other students, just pay attention to that neck. Just push that highlight a little bit deeper. Make sure it's not too much brighter than the face. All right, Kelly. So there's a bit of glare on this, so I'm going to bring the value down. Because I feel like it's a little bright. That seems a little bit more accurate. Okay. I think a lot of the portrait feels very neutral, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I think to bring a little bit more life to the color of the skin tone, I see a lot of this background color being a little more green and in your painting. And what I would do is just push that a little bit more of a mauve tone. So let me add a little bit of that here so you can get a feel for that, what that would look like. Part of the reason is that that helps to complement the warm tones that we do see in her skin. So making it kind of that purple violet. Unless you wanted it to be green, I mean, you're welcome to change the background color to something else. But if you're going to go with something that is more green, then I would definitely push maybe the color a little bit. I would maybe go more, if you're wanting it to be greenish, go with more of a teal kind of color, almost similar to her shirt. And that's going to help the skin tones kind of pop. So there's a couple of options you have there. I would definitely push it into the darker value range if you are going to do that. On this side here, and maybe a little lighter on this side. It can be a beautiful color. That kind of teal color can be really nice for complementing skin tones. It really just depends on what you're going for. So that could have been intentional. However, that purple really does help to also set off some of the skin tones, and we do see a lot of that influence in her skin. That being said, I think you have some nice rich warm red accents, but I do feel like you could use a couple of the cooler pink accents. So my suggestion would be to maybe make a color that looks similar to that could be used in the forehead and in a few select areas like down in this lower jaw. And this is especially true if you are keeping the background consistent with the picture. And don't be afraid to push that pink in the chin a little bit more. You could even borrow some of the cheek color to build some more of that dynamic range. This color is a little hard to tell, but if it's kind of a yellowish pink, because I don't have a picture of your palette, it's a little hard for me to tell. I would just brighten it up a little bit. Like if it's like that color, yeah, just make it a little bit more intense, especially right where the highlight is the strongest, and she has a little bit of that coming over this area. As far as the hair, again, focusing on that nice silhouette to help her stand forward, and if you need to, you can push some of these areas in a little bit darker. Getting a portrait to glow, a lot of people ask me about that. It really comes down to value control. Really having very strong control over where you place your highlights. It's tempting to think that the brighter I make the portrait, the more glowing it's going to be, but that's actually not true. It's about controlling the values around the portrait, pushing everything darker, and making sure those midtones have nice chroma and they're a little bit darker before you get those nice impactful highlights. And that's really what's going to give you that feeling of that glow. Of course, color does play a role in that as well, controlling your temperatures and stuff, but really when it comes down to the sense of light in a portrait, it comes down to value control. So making sure nothing competes with those really impactful highlights, where that highlight or that lightest, brightest point in the forehead sits, and that fall off of light across the face. The nose might be a little dark. I think you're pretty, I understand what you were doing there, but I would just make it maybe a little more pink, not so brown, and maybe just a little bit lighter, just because that plane is facing up. So just make that a little bit more distinct.
And then she does have that highlight writing down that left side. And maybe have that neutral somewhere in there. All right, so if you have any questions, just let me know, post them in the forum, but those are my suggestions to work on your color study. And you can see how changing that background color can have an impact, but so can if you increase the chroma of the color. It's just you might have a little more of that green influencing the skin tones. But I would recommend sticking with something to that effect. All right, and if you have any follow-up questions, just post in the forum after you've made some of your adjustments. All right, Linda, are you in here? All right, so just say hello if you are. There you are. Okay, so I first wanted to ask you if the picture is, it looks a little warm, the photograph of your color study. So I wanted to adjust some of that a little bit. So does it look warmer than your color study feels in person? My feeling is that it takes on a little too much yellow and maybe too much red. No? So that's how it looks in person? It's that warm? Okay. So I'll just reset that. Sorry, Linda, could you clarify? I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So does it look just like that yellowish light in person, or does it look a little cooler? Because I don't want to make you change a bunch of colors unnecessarily if it's just that the picture came across a little warm. It also seems maybe just a little bit bright. And that's just part of the working long distance is trying to make sure I'm not making you make changes unnecessarily. And I'm also using kind of your picture of your palette as an example. It does look pretty warm, but I also sense that your light is maybe feeling a little warm too. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward. I think your background looks pretty close because I can kind of see that color in here. I think this area just looks sunk in and dried. So I think your background seems fine. I would suggest that you go maybe darker, like a near black brown. Let me do this in a new layer here. Just to help silhouette that hair. And don't be afraid to push some of that darker value in the hair too. While she does have those brighter light sections, like she has a little bit of a light catching there, that silhouette is going to help pop her forward a little bit more. That's okay, Linda. Did you hear me ask about the contrast and the lost connection? Okay, it's cooler? Okay. Yeah, I did cool it off a little bit. So what I would suggest is really pushing some of the contrast in the hair because that is the darkest value right next to the face. And so by getting those
values a little bit darker, it's going to help kind of make her pop and get her skin tones to pop a little bit more. You can have those brighter highlights in other areas, but just notice that there is a lot more dark value kind of surrounding those areas in the hair. And you can see that's already made a difference in terms of getting her to jump forward. The same goes for the silhouette along the back of her shirt, and maybe just overall going a little bit deeper. It looks like this is the color you have for the shirt, and that's not quite coming across in the painting as much, but that looks like a good color. So I'm thinking it could just be a color shift, but I would go a little darker down here and kind of just gradually fade it. I go over some of the planes in the lessons for today, and you'll see kind of how I divide up the planes of the torso. So I would just push that a little bit. By controlling those values around her, you're going to make her pop out a little bit more. I do sense that the face has a little bit more of the cool colors. I don't know why it came across so warm. I'm going to continue to adjust that really quick. I'm going to just select select the face here and just try to, oops, just try to adjust those skin tones. Oops, here, hold on. Let me work through this. Okay, what I wanted to do was take that and I guess it's not going to let me. I thought I was going to be able to duplicate it. Let me take out some of the red, maybe. Yeah, it's not that big of a difference. Okay, so I'll just keep that in mind. Yeah, it's a cooler gray. I can see that based on your colors here. So I'm going to just kind of pull the colors from your palette here. So what I would suggest is you have some nice neutrals in here. I do sense that maybe she could use a little bit more pink in a few areas. So you might take one of these colors here, maybe even like this one might be a good step to add pink to, just so that you have something in between those two that you can use in the forehead. She does have some pink in the forehead there. So, and just use it as a transition tone. But I'd make sure it's just a little bit darker, so that it's a stepping stone to the darker, there we go, something like that. So I'll do a color swatch for you here. So you want something that's kind of like that. It's almost the value of your color palette here. And you might find yourself needing to add maybe a touch of blue to those to get that color. But I think having something like that will help, especially in these cooler zones. You could take your background color, that purple, and add a little bit of white, and it might give you the color that you need for those areas. And I can't tell, but I don't quite see this color, that transition tone that we see in her cheek on the palette. Something like that. So maybe take and find a berry kind of red color that you can use to create two more transition shades there in the cheek, especially because the chroma really pumps up in those areas, and that's going to help to sculpt the form there a little bit more. And then some of your neutral grays, like this one, is almost the perfect color to have in this lower half, or where you have these transitions. So I would introduce a little bit of that there. And that's because it's picking up some of the blue of the shirt, the blue-green of the shirt. I think that was this one that I selected. And if you find that that is jumping too quickly to that, you might take this color and add a little bit of the shirt color to get into it. So if you take this color here and add that color to it, you'll find something kind of in between that'll end up like that. And that might be a nice transition color for this lower half, where it just cools off a tiny bit more before it hits that shadow. Your shadow might be able to go a little darker as well, especially in this upper portion. You can leave some of that reflected light towards the bottom because it adds some kind of life to that lower jawline. But yeah, other than introducing a few of those kind of mauve tones, I think it looks great. So the mauve tones in that transition to the cheek, and maybe a little bit more of a greenish color next to the area that's facing her blouse, and the hair, of course, getting that contrast in the hair. That's really what's going to set the portrait apart. And so, yeah, just start with something like that. Do you have any questions? And I don't know if you heard me earlier, but if you're kind of nervous about painting over your color study, you can do an isolation layer of the liquid and let it dry, or you can just oil out your painting before you do more color swatches on top. And if you don't like the color you mixed, you can wipe it off with a Q-tip or a rag. Makes it pretty easy. Do you have any questions? Okay, so where was the gray you were talking about? I think what you're referring to is this here. Let me, so this color here, let me do this in black so it's a little easier to see. So what I did was I took this color and I mixed it with a little bit of your background color to get this color. And it's kind of a nice gray-green that she has a little bit of in here. It's a little more neutral in the photo, but if you push it in the painting a little bit, it's going to help to kind of add some vibrancy. Is that what you meant? Yeah, and then, yeah, I'll just repeat that again. The liquid can be used as like an isolation layer, very much like we did in the, for those of you who took the tonal portrait, where we had done the isolation layer over the imprimatura. You can do that over this too if you wanted to. It'll bring back all the colors to that true value, especially if your background had sunk in a little bit and it's looking not as deep as it did when it was wet. That liquid can bring back those true colors. So will oiling out. But by doing the liquid, you're also isolating this first underpainting, so that way when you paint on top, if you don't like what you did, you can wipe it off with a little bit of diluted oil on a rag and start over. Yeah, so these are some of the colors that you'll want to kind of just add them, and you can have them on like an accent section, and just use those. And you're going to find yourself using some of this in the eyes, like especially if you look in like these areas, she has some of that mauvey pink color in the around the lids, and maybe a touch more in the nose, especially right before it turns to that shadow. There's this kind of warmer hue there. All right, so I think that is everyone who turned in a color study this week. So for everyone that's here watching, do you guys have any questions about some of the color studies or some of the colors you mixed? Anything you struggled with? So Linda, did you finish? So could I show what? The nose and the eyes? Some of the colors in those areas? Sure, absolutely. So let's take some color samples there. Now, one thing you'll notice is that underneath the eyes, there tends to be this increase in chroma. Part of that is because there's the capillaries coming to the surface. And as this starts to turn towards shadow, you get this really rich kind of mauve tone, and it gets more saturated. So it's something kind of like that color, just before it turns into a dark chocolate brown for the shadow. And then if you look on the like inner corners of the eye, these reflected areas underneath, you're going to get more of like an orange red. That's something I would mix with maybe more of a cadmium, and maybe ochre, cadmium, and a little alizarin or something to that effect. Probably not much white in there. And of course that gets darker as it moves over. And I mentioned this earlier, that one of my favorite colors to use is a mixture for those really dark areas. So for example, right in here, that color there, which is something like this, I would use a little bit of transparent red oxide. I didn't have that on the list, but if you have it, try this mixture. You could also use a little burnt sienna, but transparent oxide red, alizarin crimson, or the substitute, a touch of blue, or if you need to add a little bit of opacity, you can add a little bit of yellow ochre, but it's going to give you this nice, rich, deep red that's really a beautiful, perfect color for areas like the nostrils, the crease in the lips. You know, you're going to get some of those kind of accents. So having this range here is going to help quite a bit. You'll also notice that just in general, if you ignore the eyelashes, it's kind of hard to select an area, but there tends to be a little bit more of a pinkish feeling on the lids. Now she is also wearing makeup, so that might change, but just paying attention to right in these inner corners where you have these pinker colors, even in the lighter areas, they tend to favor a little bit more of the pink, rather than like out here where we have maybe more of a peachy yellow. So you see some of that distinction there. And the same goes for the inner corner of this eye. It takes on kind of that pink tone. It's not as dark. It's almost just like a lighter color of this one. And over here it gets a little more, maybe like of a cooler pink, more of a mauve tone. As far as the nose, You will have these cooler sections where the plane turns under, but it just helps to have a little bit of a warming, even if I don't tend to see it in the photograph. I will tend to push maybe a little bit of this pink into the nose here because it helps bring the nose forward, because the reds tend to come forward and cool colors tend to recede. So just in this tip of the nose, I might have a little bit more pink before that turns under. And it's a trick I use quite often just to get the painting to read better. And one thing to note with like something like the lips is there are warmer kind of rosy hues. There's that deeper kind of brick red. But then there's like these cooler, lighter pinks as well. So you kind of have that warm, cool, warm pattern happening in the lips as well. So those are, like in your lips, they feel like a little bit more of a cad red range. So you might look for where you can find those cooler pinks that are maybe a little bit more of an alizarin mixture that are going to help balance that out. Because in this case, we have cooler lights in the lips and warmer shadows. So there's the shadow color in the lips, and here's like an average light color in the lips. And it gets cooler as it gets towards the highlight. Did that help? Yeah, it's good to see the accent colors. And Susan, so your question is, were we supposed to buy burnt sienna or use the transparent red oxide? The burnt sienna was on the supply list. I didn't have the transparent red oxide on the supply list, but it's an optional color. Sometimes I switch to transparent red oxide, but it tends to be more yellow than the burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is more of a neutral flesh tone to kind of start at. It's a good starting point. But the red oxide is a nice color when you need that darker starting point, but also where it's a little bit more of a yellow. Because when you mix it with, if you took, for example, burnt sienna and just mixed it with straight white, and then you took transparent red oxide and mixed it with straight white, and kind of made like a value swatch, you would see the difference in the tinting. So a lot of times colors can look very similar when they're dark and pure out of the tube, but as you tint them with white, you will see their behavior. So another good example is a color like English red and burnt sienna. They look very, very similar coming out of the tube. You would almost assume that they were the same color, but when you start to mix them with white, or the same goes like with like an Indian red, if you mix those with white, you would see Indian red goes towards a cool blue purple. Burnt sienna stays maybe a little bit more neutral, and then you have the English red, which goes very, very cool pink. So you know, even though they're all kind of like oxide or iron oxide based colors, or they're very similar, they out of the tube they tint differently. So whenever I add a color to my palette, one of the tricks I do just to become familiar with the color is I do a tinting test. So that's just where you add it with white and see how the color behaves, because that's going to determine why you choose that color. Does that make sense? Now I'm keeping our palette somewhat limited, and it is the basic palette I go to for my work. But I do find myself sometimes, pulling in like English red on occasion. If I have a model that has that really cool pink and I just know no other color mixture is going to give me that, and maybe alizarin is too pink, then I might pull out that English red. But sticking to this limited palette, you'll get most of the range that you need. It's just when you need, sometimes you need that really dark, rich kind of red, but alizarin crimson straight is too much. And you don't want to use black because that just deadens the color. So a good area for that would be like the nostrils. Well, we want that to be like a rich kind of red, deep red. So I use that alizarin red oxide and a little bit of blue mixture for those areas where I need something that appears black, but it has some richness and depth to it. Okay, any other questions, guys? We're kind of wrapping up a little earlier today. Make some adjustments to your color studies, and I mentioned this in a message I posted on the forum, so go over there and read that. But you guys will be getting your week 5 lesson early. That's where we actually work on the main demonstration, but right now there are some lectures on the planes, and we talk a little bit about the planes of the individual features as well as the planes of the head. And I do a tiling demo digitally, just to kind of get us warmed up back to the idea of painting full color on our larger portrait. And you might consider mixing larger piles of each of these colors once you've made your adjustments. You want piles that are maybe at least the size of a quarter or, you know, a dollar coin, because if you don't have enough color as you're working and you're covering a lot more ground than you did in your color study, you have a lot more painting to cover. You don't want to have to stop and remix that color just because you ran out of it. So just mix nice healthy piles. They also don't tend to dry out as quickly if you mix a nice healthy pile and follow some of the guidelines I gave on how to save your colors week to week. Yeah, I know I throw a lot of information at you guys. All right, well, thank you so much. I'm glad you guys found this helpful, and I hope you enjoy the lessons that are up for you to watch today. And I should have the week 5 lessons to you somewhere in the middle of the week, because I want to give everyone plenty of time to work on their block in. It's going to be a bit of work, so watch those other lessons that are available to you over the weekend, and I should have that other week 5 to you probably midweek. I'm thinking by Wednesday. So just work on your color studies in the meantime as well. All right, everyone. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.